Good morning. This is the Accessibility and Disability Policy webinar series. Today we have with us Brenda Nelson, who is going to be talking about transition through all ages and stages. Brenda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone who's taking the time to get on this webinar, and I especially appreciate the invitation from the Governor's Committee to present this webinar. I have presented this presentation many times at various conferences and also in a webinar format in a previous job that I had. My contact information is on the screen. There is a handout that will be posted that's more of a concise overview of the information that'll be on the slides. So it's not the PowerPoint, but kind of a more user-friendly handout, and that'll be available. I did not put my information on that handout, however, so go ahead and jot that down if you'd like to have it. Just to introduce myself before we get going, so you can know a little bit about me and where I come from. I am first and foremost a parent of a child with a disability. And so the information I'm going to share with you today is lessons that I have learned by doing and mistakes I have made, certainly, information that has been shared by other parents and professionals as we've been on the journey. My son is getting ready to turn 20 next month, which is scary and exciting all at the same time. He began, his name is John, and he began receiving special education services with ECI at the age of 16 months, and then went into the PBCD program at age 3 and received those special education services all the way through his high school graduation last year in 2018. It's been a whole year, I can't believe it. He is now attending our local junior college where we live, and he is doing an automotive technology program, and he's doing really great there. He was diagnosed, we first heard the word autism with him at around the age of 3 and was diagnosed around the age of 6. So I come from that autism perspective, but the information I'm going to share with you can apply to any disability. And I always give a disclaimer every time I present, and that is that I'm going to give you a whole lot of information about a whole lot of different ideas. And some of those ideas will sound really good to you, and some of them you'll say, no, that's not going to work for my child or my student. And that's okay. Pick and choose the information that is relevant to you and tuck the rest away for future, or maybe you're going to run across somebody that might also benefit from that information. So filter the information through what makes sense to you and use what you can with this. So we're talking today about transition through all ages and stages. So we're really going to talk about the whole gamut of transition from birth all the way through adulthood. So I've got a lot of information to cover, and like Randy said, if you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll take time at the end, as much time as we need to answer questions, or you can contact me at my contact information. I'll be glad to answer questions there. So what is transition? Well, transition by definition is movement, passage, or change from one position, state, stage, subject, or concept to another. Really, in a nutshell, next slide, Randy, transition is change. And every transition that we go through, whether you have a disability or not, I don't know about you, but change is difficult. It's difficult for me. It's difficult for a lot of people. And for our children and our students, it can potentially cause difficulty at any stage. And we may not even understand what is causing the difficulty, or what is causing the for them to be upset about something. But you can bet that possibly it has to do with change. Parents just naturally learn to adapt for their children. We just kind of, it's a survival mode that we go into sometimes, and we just learn to adapt to things that are going on. We may need to seek, assistance from outside help to figure out some things. But transitions do get easier with maturity and with time, and we do eventually, hopefully, figure out how to make those transitions easier. So the tips I'm going to give you today, we're going to talk about 2 different types of transition. Next slide, Randy. So we're going to quickly talk about 2 different types of transition. Daily transitions, which would be from school, home, and community, and also different educational transitions. So at each stage, as our children or students move up through their age, they're going to encounter different transitions as they move from one school setting to another and all the way out into adulthood. So we're going to cover all of those here in the next few minutes. So what can a parent and teacher do to help with transitions? Well, first, we can understand that transition is difficult for some children and some adults, and especially for those on the autism spectrum. They just naturally have difficulty with transition. But any disability can be affected that way, and even not having a disability. Change is just difficult, and we need to be understanding as parents and adults that this may be an issue. We can help with that by planning and preparing for those transitions, thinking ahead to what the transitions are, and kind of get into a habit of helping to prepare for those transitions. So let's talk about daily transitions first. And I apologize, I'm going to keep sipping water because I've got an allergy thing going on. So daily transitions. Let's talk about school first. Transitions at school, and you may not even thought about that these different movements to different areas are transitions and potential triggers for anxiety or difficulties. So moving from one activity or subject to another within the classroom is a transition. So let's say they're in maybe a 3rd grade classroom and they are busy doing math work, and the teacher says, okay, math is over, now we're going to move on to reading. Well, maybe your student hasn't finished their math work, or maybe something else is going on, and all of a sudden we're shifting gears and changing. That's difficult. It can be difficult for them. Moving from one location to another within the school, either going to the library, or maybe it's time to go to PE or to lunch. At the secondary level, they're changing classes all the time. Now, even if you have students that are in a self-contained setting, there's still going to be transition times throughout the day when they're going to be moving from one place to another or one activity to another. So let's keep those in mind as we think about the strategies here in a minute. Then we have daily transitions at home, which are very similar to things at school. It's still movement from one activity to another or one place to another. But at home, it may be that we're moving to mealtime, or maybe it's bath time or bedtime. Maybe it's playtime. Maybe we're leaving the house and going someplace else, to the store or to school. Maybe we're traveling out of town. Any of these things, and I think the key to it is fear of the unknown. At least that was for my son. Going to a new place would be difficult because there's new sounds, new environment, new people, new everything. And that would cause a lot of anxiety. So if I could prepare him ahead of time for these changes as much as possible, that made the transitions easier. And we'll talk about some of these strategies here in just a minute. Okay, so go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you some tools that helped us, have helped other families, some ideas that hopefully will give you some things to think about, or at least try if you're having difficulties with various transitions at home or at school. So the first one is to give adequate warning. Go ahead and change the slide, Randy. Give adequate warning before a change in activity, like 15 minutes before the activity is going to change, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. And this works in the classroom and at home, because if they get used to doing something at home and they do it at school and it's different, then there has to be communication between school and home. And it makes it much easier if you're doing the same thing in both places. It was funny, when my son was in first grade, they had, go ahead back to the previous slide, Randy. When my son was in first grade, the teachers, all of the teachers in first grade, used a countdown method. And they would say, okay, well, everybody, we're going to line up, and they would start counting from 5 to 1 slowly. And by the time you get to 1, you were supposed to be where you were going to be. And so she would count, 5, 4, 3. Well, she told me about this one day, and my son was able to do this with the class. He was moving with everybody, and he was following along and getting in line or doing whatever they needed to do with this countdown. And so I said, well, I'm going to try that at home and see what happens. So, we were going to be going someplace, or we're going to be leaving in a few minutes, or it's time to go. And I started counting just like the teacher. And his eyes got so big, like, how does she know about this? How does she know about this counting thing? He didn't like it. But it did work. It worked. And it worked because he was doing it at school. It was familiar for him at school. It was familiar then at home. And I did use that quite a bit, actually, the countdown. He didn't necessarily like it, but it did move him in that direction. When you give that warning, that time warning that something's going to happen, let's say maybe we're going to be leaving the house in 10 minutes. I'm going to make sure, first of all, that I have their attention. So I can't just call from the other room and go, hey, we're leaving in 10 minutes, because that doesn't work. They will be so involved in what they're doing. Maybe they're playing a game, or maybe they're playing with their trains, or watching something on TV, or just engrossed in an activity and not even hear you say there is a warning. So always make eye contact and say, look at my eyes. We have 10 minutes, we're leaving. We found out the hard way that if John was involved in, Thomas the Tank Engine was a big thing when he was young. And when he would be involved in that, watching a Thomas episode, there was no leaving until that episode was completed. There's no turning it off in the middle of the episode. That was, meltdown material. So we had to learn to either, you're not going to watch something at all before we leave, or we would have to wait until it was completed. But we had to kind of work within those parameters if we didn't want to endure the meltdowns that would go on. So it's just some things that we have to think about and prepare for. All right, so one way to help with this is to use a visual timer. Time is a very abstract concept. It's very difficult for children and students to understand time because you can't see it. It's abstract. And so the use of a timer that counts down or counts up is very helpful. And we used a timer for a long time. Probably all the way through middle school, we used a timer for various things. So here's just some pictures of some different ideas. It can even be just a kitchen timer that you have in your kitchen. It can be a digital timer. There's timers on the phone. The visual timer is great because you can actually see time moving. They can see it moving. So there's ones that can be used in the classroom that are visual, and it helps them know that time is passing and this is how much time I have. It's really hard then to argue with the timer. So the great thing about using a timer is that you say, well, I'm sorry, the timer says that time's up and it's time to go, or it's time to go take your bath, or it's time to go to bed, or whatever. And so they're not arguing with you about it. They're arguing, you know, you can argue with the timer if you like, but the timer's not going to argue back. So a visual timer is a very effective tool at school and at home. Another tool that is very effective is a picture schedule. This is good for non-readers before they can read, to use picture schedules. And if you have children that are in or have been in PPCD or elementary school, then you often probably see picture schedules around their classroom. Well, these can be used at home also for various things. And so that transition between home and school and the communication that goes on between home and school is important. And the more consistency you have between those two settings, the better results you'll get. And so we had picture schedules for everything from getting ready in the morning and all of the steps that needed to be done to get ready to go to school in the morning, to just even a toothbrushing routine. Any of those things can be done by a picture schedule. And all schools have a program called Board Maker. That's where they get these icons. So your school can help you out and develop some of these picture icons with you. Or you can just go on the internet and get real life pictures of things. We had a book at one point when communication was really difficult, and it would have pictures of different things like a bottle of juice, the container of milk, and things where he could, it was sort of a PEC system, where he could show us what he was wanting. But the picture schedule can help, definitely. Once they become a reader, go ahead, next slide is fine. Once they become a reader, we can start using written schedules and checklists. Again, this depends on the abilities of your child, and some of these things will work for them and some of them may not. The one on the left of the slide is showing a schedule, a daily class schedule. It's in a classroom at school. And that's very helpful for them to know what is coming next. Because like I said, transition can often be just fear of not knowing what is next in the sequence of events. And so this is a movable one that the teacher could change if something special comes up. We're having a field trip that day or whatever it is. The one on the right is actually a schedule that we used with John. In third grade, when he was in third grade, and he had some phenomenal third grade teachers. He was in the general education classroom with supports. And the teacher said, you know, he's just not getting the morning routine. He's not understanding what he's supposed to do when he comes in the morning. And I said, oh, okay, so what goes on in the morning? What is the schedule, or what is he supposed to be doing that he's not doing? And she gave me this whole list of the routine that she had taught everybody that they were supposed to do in the morning, and that he wasn't getting. So she gave me the routine, and I said, well, let's try doing a checklist. And so he and I together sat down at the computer, and we put the checklist in, and it's all different colors and it's all different fonts, because I let him pick out the colors and the fonts so he could buy into this, because that's a big thing about working transition, is they got to buy into it or they're not going to do it. And so he was at that time very into race cars, Herbie the Love Bug, Volkswagens, all those kinds of things. So we found some pictures, we put those on there, and we laminated it. And when he took it to school, and we made sure that he understood what it said, all the steps of it. And it was laminated so he could take the teacher's dry erase marker or her vis-a-vis marker from the overhead, and he could check off the boxes as he was completed each task. And that was a huge motivator, just to use the teacher's pen. You wouldn't think that that's a big deal, but that was a pretty big deal, actually. And so it would sit on his desk, and he would check everything off. And you know, the teacher communicated back to me the first day and said, oh my gosh, this is great. He did all the steps. He completed it. It was wonderful. Next day, same thing. You know, he needed the schedule written down for about a week, and then he had the routine, and then he didn't need the chart anymore. But it was as simple as putting a checklist in place and letting him physically check it off to get that schedule down. And then there was no more problem. And then we didn't need it anymore. So let's talk about major schedule changes or events before they occur. This was really important for us, especially at school, because those changes, those things that would mess up the routine, like field trips, fire drills, early dismissal days, pep rally days, all of those things could potentially, because my son was very rule bound, and he wanted to have the same schedule all the time, and that's not how life is, unfortunately. And so we would make sure that teachers would tell him, and it was even in his IEP accommodations, that he would get a warning. So like the day before or the week before, hey, there's going to be a field trip. And part of that was informing me also, so that I could reinforce that at home. Fire drills, or school personnel know generally when there's going to be a fire drill, and there will be a plan for certain students. And so even fire drills, as long as the staff is aware and can plan for it, that would help with the anxiety with that change. Because a fire drill could throw them off for the whole rest of the day. It was really difficult. Early dismissal days, you know, different things that would change up the schedule. And so we had a provision in the IEP all the way through junior high, I'd say, that he needed to get adequate warning a day or two before something like that was going to be different. And as he grew older and matured, he was better at being able to navigate those changes than he was when he was younger. At home, when we would be running errands, we would talk about all the places that we were going and the order that we would do them in. And then if plans changed, then we would provide an alternative plan. So for example, you know, well, we were planning to go to the zoo, but it's raining, and it's not very good to go to the zoo when it's raining, but we can go to a movie instead. And we'll go to the zoo when it's sunny, you know, and just communicating and being flexible is important. Okay, so next slide. So if you have any questions, remember, place those in the Q&A box, and I'll answer those at the end of the end of the content. So let's talk about yearly transitions at school. Every new school year brings new faces and new places, and those transitions take planning. I've done parent training for a lot of years, a long time, and one thing that I learned very early on is that as parents, we can set ourselves up as the team leader for our child's team. And I'll share with you some ways that we can do that in a minute. But if you think about the timeline of your child's life, and that it is on a timeline, or their school time is on a timeline, we're the ones, the parents are the ones that are there through that whole timeline. So we were there in the beginning. We have the history. We are looking ahead, not just to the next year, but many years down the road. And so we're the consistent member of that team, whether it's the IEP team, the 504 team, whatever team it is, we're the consistent member. And so we can play a huge part in setting them up for success by communicating their needs to those committees that are helping them. And so we're going to think about 4 P's: placement, preview, practice, and provide. So placement, this is something that I would discuss with school personnel every year, at least in elementary school, and even on into the secondary setting. Now, it's not always possible to discuss placement if your child's in a self-contained setting. That's pretty much a set, set personnel that are in there. They may change from year to year, but you're not going to have a whole lot of choices. My son was in a general education setting, and I would have a conversation at the end of the school year. So we're approaching the end of the school year right now. And this is about the time that I would be having this conversation with the school, with usually the assistant principal was the one that would be setting schedules for the next year. And we would sit down and say, this is the kind, I just want to remind you, this is the kind of classroom that my son does well in. He does well in a classroom that is highly structured. He does well with a teacher that will put her arm around him and give him a squeeze when he needs it. He does well, with other students that know him. I would give them I would not say I want this specific teacher, because they didn't ever like that, and they, and things change over the summer sometimes. But I would say this is the kind of classroom that he needs. And we were pretty successful in placing him specifically with teachers that would match up with the setting that he was most successful in. So have that conversation with them. This is a good time to do that, and set them up for success. And it's not always possible. When John was in 5th grade, there were 3 teachers. They would rotate to 3 teachers, and 2 of the teachers out of the 3 were right up his alley. They, did exactly what the classroom, the way he needed it to be done, and one of them not so much. But so we had to compromise, and that was okay. We need to consider inclusion options and supports that are needed. And we know how our child learns best, and we can communicate that. Is it small group? Is there, what kind of structure do they need? What kind of accommodations are helpful for them? We can observe the placement before making a decision. Perhaps your child, they're wanting to put your child in a more restrictive setting. Go visit it first. Go and see with your own eyes if that's going to be an appropriate placement. I had a friend who in high school, her son was in high school, and they were looking at community-based instruction outside of the classroom, and wanted to put him in a certain placement. This is in high school. She went and observed that placement and came back to the ARD committee and said, I've been there, I've seen it, I don't feel like that's going to be the best placement for him. So observe those placements, go and look at them, and so you can make an informed decision and help the ARD committee. Remember that placement is an ARD committee decision, and the ARD committee needs to work with you on the placement and think about that. Okay, next slide. So preview. We can arrange for the child to meet the teachers one-on-one before the first day of school. This is especially important if they are in a general education setting. And it's important to do it when it's not meet the teacher night with everybody there, because that can be overwhelming. So we would always, all the way up through high school, all the way up through senior year in high school, he would go walk his schedule. We would meet the teachers beforehand, and it really made the first day of school much easier, a much easier transition for the first day of school. You can request a parent-teacher conference or a staffing. That would be the professional term that you might hear. We're going to have a staffing before school begins, and make sure that everyone is aware of the IEP goals and accommodations. I learned the very hard way not to assume that everybody that was going to be working with my son had been informed about his needs and accommodations and IEP goals, because they hadn't. And we had an incident where I learned this, I think he was in 1st grade, And I get a call from the administrator. He's in the office. He had a meltdown in art. Okay, what happened in art? Well, I come to find out, long story short, that the art teacher wasn't even aware that he had a disability because she hadn't been given the paperwork. So I started having those conferences before school started so that I could sit down with the whole team and we would make sure that we all understood the goals and the accommodations, because accommodations go from one setting to another, and that we were all in understanding of those. So that's why, I mean, don't assume anything. Don't assume that they know. You are the team leader. You give them that information and make sure that they all understand what the expectations are going into a new school year. And you can set that up, you know, with whoever sets, you know, you should have a case manager who is the special educator who is responsible for those IEP goals. That would be a good person to touch base with to set this up and just say, I need a staffing with everybody. We did this in high school all the way through the senior year, and it was just a given by the time we got there. They knew we were coming. And it was great. We would sit down, and later on, and I'll share with this in a little bit, but later on, John would be the one that would be presenting information to them because he was speaking for himself at that point and advocating for himself. The next point, if moving to a new school campus, go visit the campus several times before the start of school. It's the familiarity with it that can ease anxiety. So if some of the larger school districts, rezoning is an issue a lot, and a lot of schools are laid out the same, but they may not be. You know, you may have 5th grade in one wing in one school and it's 1st grade in another school. Or we need to find where all the places are, the cafeteria, where the buses drop off, where's the office, where's the nurse. All of those things can help them be more comfortable moving from one setting to another, and from one campus to another. And administrators work through the summer, and school buildings are accessible in the summer. So you can just arrange with them and say, hey, we want to come and walk the halls and just get familiar with the school. Even driving by the school frequently is a good idea. Note all of these requests in the ARD minutes if necessary, and don't take no for an answer. Go back to the practice slide, Randy, one before this, please. Okay. So then we can practice walking the schedule. You know, it's especially important at the secondary level if they are accessing general education settings, to practice that schedule ahead of time. Practice locker combinations. I was very concerned when we went into middle school, even though they didn't have, at our school, they didn't have lockers in the hallway, they did have lockers in the gym. And when we were going to PE, he was going to have to be able to work that lock and change his clothes and all that kind of stuff. So we were able to provide a lock that he could practice on during the summer. Some schools will do that, some won't. They could issue the lock ahead of time. There's all kinds of ways that you can get around certain things like that. You can get that schedule ahead of time, the teacher's schedule, and not wait until the day before school to find out who the teacher is. Our students need to know ahead of time so that they can mentally prepare for those changes and those transitions. The next tip is to provide. And we use the student introduction portfolio from kindergarten all the way through senior year, and it was not always in the same format. The format that is on the screen here is actually kind of a short book that gave all the great information about my child that is not in the IEP, because an IEP is all about things that they cannot do. The IEP is all about the deficits. And we want to share the great things that they can do. And we want to share pictures and information about all the wonderful things that they can do. And it's also a great advocacy tool, self-advocacy tool. As my son got older and moved into secondary, we started providing just a 2-page introduction with important information. And I always included the IEP goals and accommodations in there. And we give a copy to every teacher. When we got into high school, he started doing his own presentation. He would put together a PowerPoint and present that information. And it could be a PowerPoint you put together, but they're presenting it. There's so many different ways you can do it. So check out texasprojectfirst.org, and there's a great place on there in the, I think it's the special education section, about student introduction portfolios. And I'm happy to share. I have a shareable document. So if you want to see one of the ones that I did for John or several, I'll be happy to send it to you. Just email me. Okay. Now let's talk about educational transitions. And we're going to move from one thing to the next pretty rapidly. So go ahead on to the next slide. So let's talk about preschool to elementary, just some things to think about. It's a longer school day. There's no more nap time when you get into elementary school out of preschool. The classes are larger. There's more unstructured time, lunch, recess, PE. And surprisingly, there's usually less support provided, and it's more sensory stimulating when you get into those areas like lunch, recess, PE. And the support goes away. So that's a discussion for the ARD committee if that is a potential difficulty for your child. It's important as much as possible, and I realize that my audience today has a wide variety of disabilities, a wide variety of abilities, and so again, filter this through information that makes sense to you, but as much as possible, stay on grade level. If there's not an intellectual disability that's been diagnosed, then keep them on grade level as much as you can. That's important as they get older. It may not seem as important when they're little, but by the time you're approaching high school graduation, it's vitally important to look at those options. Think least restrictive, more inclusion with support. Placement should not be determined by the school. That is an ARD committee decision, and you as a parent are part of the ARD committee, an important part. And so least restrictive is important. And we want to think about that the more time that they have with their non-disabled peers, research shows that the outcomes are better. So we have to, that's why least restrictive has to be considered by the ARD committee. Think long-term and big picture. What skills will be needed at the next level to be successful? For example, when my son was in elementary school, I knew he had great difficulty with writing. And I was just concerned that as he got older and the writing demands were more, that he was going to need to be able to have access to keyboarding skills. So we started keyboarding skills. Now it's a thing, I think, with everybody. But back then, it wasn't a thing with everybody. And so we actually put that in the IEP, that he would have some keyboarding skills to be prepared for the next level. So whatever that is, you're thinking long-term down the road, several years, whereas the school is typically just thinking about the next year and what's needed there. So keep that in mind. And transition to adulthood begins now. What? In elementary school, we're thinking about adulthood? Yeah. The skills that you're building every single day with your child are skills that are going to move them into adulthood eventually. So keep that in mind that every skill that they're building, whether it's self-regulation, whether it's following a schedule, whether it's reading time or, telling time. All of these things are skills that we're going to need in the future, and we're going to build on that. Okay, so let's move to elementary to middle school. It requires more independence at the middle school age. Even if they're in a self-contained classroom, you want to give them as much independence as possible. That should be our goal, and that is what students want if you ask them. Classes change every 45 to 60 minutes. There's more teachers. Middle school is all about socialization and fitting in. For me, and with John in general ed setting, lunch was a huge concern. And I had many conversations with school personnel as we were moving into that time. And we had just moved to another town. So this was why it was really a concern, because he didn't know anybody at the school. But lunch can be a big concern. And so we had conversations, and we're even plotting ways to get him to be okay at lunch. And the funny thing is that all the plotting and talking that we did as adults about this really didn't matter, because he found friends. He made some friends that he connected with. And actually, it was a whole group of kids that were really just like him, that just wanted to sit and eat their lunch and not talk to anybody. And they were perfectly fine with that. We were the ones that were all concerned about it, and they were oblivious to it. They were like, we just want to eat our lunch and not have to converse with anybody. And they were cool with that. So, but think about that is a part of the middle school culture. Consider the level of support carefully. Too much support can cause social isolation. Think about the very least amount of support that they need to move from one place to another, and start with that. Because having somebody shadow you down the hall or be right next to you is going to cause some social isolation. And maybe you can shadow from 10 feet down the hall or 20 feet down the hall and still be there for the necessary reasons that you need to be there, but not necessarily be right next to them. So you just have to think about that as they move up in grade level. Lockers, we kind of already talked about that. That can be a challenge. Bullying is always a forefront in our mind for a lot of us as parents of children with disabilities. And so the way that we kind of addressed bullying in the middle school time, really all the way through elementary school, we talked to John about tell an adult, even if it was with his older brother and there was a conflict going on there, just because brothers are brothers. If somebody's bothering you, tell an adult. And so that was kind of the way that we would deal with that. And we got him to understand that if I tell an adult, that adult is going to follow through. So when we got to middle school, we made it clear, this is what we have taught John, that he is going to tell an adult, because he can't differentiate between just teasing, whether it's bullying. He was not able to do that. He couldn't tell the difference. He just knew somebody was bothering him and he didn't like it. And it could cause a reaction, which would typically end him in trouble and not the bully or the person bothering him. But we made it clear to the administrators, this is how we're going to deal with this. And if he comes and tells you, and we identified the people that he should go tell, any teacher, the principal, the counselor, the officer that was on campus, any of those people were safe people to tell. And if he told them, then we expected them to follow through. And it worked very well all the way through high school. We had a few incidents in middle school, and we took care of it because we had a clear understanding between all of us. And then hang on for the ride, because puberty is that's a whole other topic for a whole other day. But let me just say that, behaviors change when puberty arrives. Just things happen and you have to think about what is this sudden change that's happening in my child, and consider that it could actually be a hormonal change that's going on, and that can cause great distress. And we went through it for several years before that kind of all evened out. Emotions are out of control, more anxiety, new behaviors, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so then we move into middle school, from middle school to high school. All of the things that I just mentioned apply at this level also. We need to know that post-secondary transition planning begins at the age of 14 in Texas. IDEA says age 16, but in Texas we start at 14. And that means that there's going to be some planning that goes on with your ARD committee to plan for transition out of high school. What is going to happen? And I'm going to go through that in a little bit of detail in another couple slides. So we'll talk about that transition. We need to understand graduation requirements and plan accordingly. And go back to the middle school slide, please, Randy. The high school requirements seem to always be changing.
I apologize. My hand sometimes touches something. I don't even realize it. So
that's okay. Go back to, I think 2 slides is where we're going. Back to middle school to high school. It's one more slide back. There we go. Right there. Okay. So that's okay. As they're moving into high school, we need to know what the graduation requirements are. I have 2 boys. My older son graduated in 2015 under a completely different set of graduation requirements than my younger one, John, did last year. It was different. They change it. They make adjustments to graduation requirements. You need to understand what those are. So discuss it with the counselor at school, discuss it with the ARD committee, make sure you understand what is required for graduation, and plan accordingly with your ARD committee. Choose electives carefully as they are moving into high school. This is a great time when they can explore hidden talents, when they can explore ideas and things that they might like to do, because you've got electives that can be built into their schedule. John is very interested in hands-on activities, hands-on things. So he took a welding class, and that was a great skill. He wasn't so great at it, but he learned about it. He learned how to do it. It's something that he could participate in. His junior year, we were fortunate. We were in a small school district that had a lot of vocational programs, and vocational programs are coming back into schools. But we have an automotive program, and he took that his junior year. And it was very hands-on. They rebuilt an engine and did all of that. And that's what he's doing now. He found out that that's what he likes, and it helped to kind of set his path for what he wanted to do after high school. So whether it's floral design or culinary or welding or whatever it is, use those electives in high school to help them figure out a direction or an interest. There's a guy in Houston who is in a wheelchair. He's not verbal. He is limited mobility, but he could shred papers and loved to shred papers. And now he has a business, his own business, going around and shredding papers for businesses. And he's supporting himself that way. So you never know what's going to spark their interest. And try out different things with electives. And the school needs to provide support in those non-academic settings. They must provide support. I don't have the legal reference with me at the moment, but you can go to the legal framework and look for non-academic setting and see what that reference is, or email me and I'll send it to you. but support needs to be provided in those non-academic settings. Okay, next slide. Sorry. So let's talk about high school to adult life. I say that parents drive the transition process, and that's because when we come out on the other side, whether it is at graduation or at age 22, we are the ones that are there, the parents. At school, their obligation to us is ended. They have no more obligation to us. So we need to drive that transition process. We need to be a part of it. It's a coordinated set of activities that are moving us toward that end result of more independence, hopefully. And we need to know our rights, and we need to use those rights. We need to be realistic and not give up on learning as they move toward adulthood. And at this point, we focus on abilities, strengths, interests, and preferences. And that's what the law says. It says that transition goals need to focus on their strengths. What are they good at? What are they interested in? And what are their preferences? When my son was first starting to look at getting a job, while he was still in high school, and we were working with Workforce Commission, TWC, vocational rehab, and we had a job coach, and the job coach just was insisting that he was going to work at a fast food restaurant. And he said, I don't want to work at a fast food restaurant. I am not interested in that, nor do I prefer that. And so we had to work around that and make them understand that his strengths, interests, and preferences are what needs to be at the forefront, not just what's available. We're looking at abilities versus disabilities at this point. Everything up until this point in high school has been about all the things they can't do and their challenges. Now we get to focus on what can they do, what will they do, what are they good at, and everybody has something that they can do. And so transitions is that coordinated set of activities. And what does that mean? It means the school is working with the parents and with adult service providers to all coordinate these activities that will move us toward adulthood. Okay, next slide. So as we are planning for this transition, we need to keep the student at the center of the plan. You may have heard the terms person-centered planning, self-determination, person-centered thinking. All of those things are what we need to be thinking about as we plan transition. Again, their strengths, interests, and preferences must be considered. At 14 is when we start doing this. And we have to know that at the age of majority in the state of Texas is 18. And that means that they are considered legally considered an adult at the age of 18. And so they are making their own decisions, including educational at that point. And most students are junior, senior in high school when they turn 18. So you may have some time still in school when they are in charge. And that's a little bit scary. So if guardianship needs to be considered, we need to do that before the 18th birthday. That we could also use an educational power of attorney or a supported decision-making agreement to participate as parents in that ARD when they are in charge if we don't have guardianship. So it's all these things that you have to think about as they move into that next phase. Okay, next slide. So the transition plan, really quickly, actually has 4 different goals. It's not just one goal, transition goal, but we have to look at 4 different areas. We have to look at post-secondary education or vocational training. And so one of John's goals look like he will consider a course of study in a 2-year or 4-year university. And we would explore those things. We would go and visit colleges and we would go do that. Maybe it's a training program. Maybe it's something else that they're going to do, but you have to consider that, and the ARD committee has to consider it. This is the law. Employment. What employment are we going to look at? What are they interested in doing post-secondary for employment? What independent living skills do they need to work on? For us, it was getting his driver's license. I knew that he was going to be able to get his driver's license, but it took a longer and more winding road to get it. He didn't get it at 16 like other kids did. He got it at 17 and a half, but we all worked toward that goal, and it was an important goal for him toward independence. And when he did get that driver's license, the independence shot through the roof. It was amazing. And his self-confidence was really great. Community participation also must be considered. So all of these things are built into the transition plan that the school is doing, but all of us are participating in it. So it is not a plan that just the school is responsible for, like IEP goals. It is parents, adult service providers, and school working together. Post-secondary goals begin with a comprehensive assessment of strengths and needs. Any goals that we set need to be based on an assessment that is a good one that will tell us information. That's why it's really important to get with Workforce Commission, Vocational Rehab Services, because they can do some really good comprehensive assessments if your student qualifies for their services. So you can check on that starting in the freshman year in high school and get with TWCVR. Okay. Next slide. Post-secondary goals must be specific and measurable, just like IEP goals. And here are some of the adult services that we can contact and be in touch with during high school. We used to call the local mental health authority, used to be called the MHMRA. Mental health, mental retardation authority, but we don't use that word anymore. And so they renamed themselves. Now it's the LMHA or the LIDA, you may hear. But there's also TWCVR, vocational rehab. There's independent living centers and Social Security. So all of these entities can be contacted as they're going into high school. There's no longer you have to be eligible for adult services. It's not a given at that point. So in a nutshell, transition is change, and with a little planning, you can understand, and understanding, you can be ready for that change. So I'm ready for questions. Whew, that was a lot of information, I know.
Oops. Yes, ma'am.
Do we have any questions?
We have a couple, yes.
Okay.
You have suggestions for getting middle school, high school child to keep up with the schedule expectations at school. To get him to bring information home is also another question, how to do that, and especially for activities that are not routine, such as band activities.
Okay. So we were very successful. I'm assuming that this student is in a general education placement if they're doing band and various classes at secondary. We were very successful with a binder with folders that were labeled inside the binder, and the case manager helped with this, and she was the one that we made responsible for checking in with him. So having one person that they can check in with as opposed to all of the different teachers. And she would help make sure that things were organized. And, you know, once he got the hang of putting things in the right folder that was labeled, that was very helpful. So you can even, like we would have the front of the binder, we had homework, a homework divider, and he would stick homework in there. And then, you know, then we had math, reading, whatever. So you could even have a divided section that is for band or whatever activity it is, where that information would go. And it also has to be communication with the teachers. I mean, they have to understand we have this binder, this is the system we're using. Make sure that if it's important information, it gets in there. In high school, I was having a real struggle with algebra, with him in algebra. And it was the teacher was not super organized. And so she would update grades like all at once. And I would think everything is great. And then all of a sudden, like, we're passing, and then all of a sudden we're failing because all of these zeros went in the grade book. And then I'd freak out, and I was like, where's all these papers and all of this? And so finally, I had to put my foot down about the sophomore year, and I said, look, he does not communicate with me what needs to be done. We tried planners, we tried electronic devices, we tried everything under the sun. Organization is difficult, very difficult for a lot of students. Eventually he got it, but I had to put my foot down and say, I need the case manager to contact every teacher each week and let me know if there's a major assignment due or a major test or something. They didn't like that, but that's what we needed. That's what he needed to make sure that we would get that work in. And it was successful. And the junior year, I don't know what happened, the light bulb came on and he became responsible, and after all those years of trying, and we finished out okay. So work on different methods, but I highly recommend the binder, and when they can get trained to be sure to put the things in the right spot, it's a lot easier.
Very good. Can you give information about TWC's vocational rehabilitation services, where to go or who to ask at the school?
Okay, so your diagnostician or whoever runs your ARD meetings should have the information. It could be the case manager. It's different at different schools, so I can't say exactly who, but you are going to ask for the vocational rehabilitation contact for your school, and it goes by county. So where we are, I'm in Wharton County, and it's a large county, but there's not a lot of, we only have like, I think 4 high schools in that county. So we only have one VR counselor, and we didn't actually have one for a long time. And so there's going to be, the larger school districts will have more VR counselors, but you ask the whoever runs your ARD at your school, I need the contact information for our VR counselor. How do I get in touch? And then you contact them and say, I need to do an intake. And they will make an appointment with you, sit down, you and your student sit down and decide, first of all, if they would qualify, which just about everybody qualifies now for VR, and what can they do to help with transition. It used to be that you didn't contact them really till the junior or senior year, but now they have transition counselors that are specifically there to help starting in 9th grade all the way through graduation. And that's really important to get with them. Like I said, they can do assessments. We had a whole battery of assessments done to figure out really what would John be good at? What are his aptitudes? What are his, where would he be good at working? And that's all about work. And now you need to contact your mental health authority if they need, you need to be on the waiting list for the community-based services. Those waiting lists are, 12 years long, 15 years long. Mental health authority, you contact them for that. They can also do assessments. So really, you need to contact both and just see which services fit your child and their needs. I hope that helps.
And we did a VR transition webinar, mostly transitioning from high school out, and the services and programs that they have, especially for the summer. So I will send a link with a follow-up email with that information. In it, you will find all the contacts for the main leads for transition in the various VR regions. So I'll make sure that's in a follow-up email, so participants have that information.
Yeah, VR is it's very important. In fact, they can pay for things like, they have the Earn and Learn program that goes on in the summer. That's coming up. My son did that one year. He worked for our local tractor dealer, and they didn't have to pay him. The VR paid him, and he made $10 an hour. It's a short-term thing, but it gives them some job skills, some job experience. They can pay for school tuition, books, all kinds of things like that. So you want to be in touch with vocational rehab. Anything that will get them to work, they're all about getting them to work.
Right.
So if something, they even helped us with the driving. There's driving rehabilitation, because as he he had his driver's permit, and then we were going along doing our driving practice to, you got to drive 30 hours with your parent. And he told me to quit being a nagging grandma. And I went, okay, this is not going to work, because we were like, this. And so I told our counselor, I said, I'm not comfortable with him being ready to drive yet and take his driving test, and he is not ready, but he can be ready, but we need some extra help. And they paid for vocational driving, rehabilitative driving, that came down. They did an assessment. They gave him 30 hours in the car, and he was ready to go get his driver's license. So there's lots of things VR can do to help.
Everything that leads to, like you said, employment. At some point, if it's training to get to employment, or if it's the books in school to get to employment, or if it's an accommodation, so you can become employed. I know they have purchased hearing aids for people that are hard of hearing, or even if you become disabled on the job, they can come in and help. So I don't see any more questions. Let's ask one last time. Are there any additional questions for Ms. Nelson?
Put them in the Q&A. You might want to put that first slide back up. I don't know if you can go all the way back, but that has my contact information. And there. You can contact me through my website or nelsoneducationalconsulting@yahoo.com, and my number. And so contact me if other questions come up. I'm happy to help.
Well, I don't see any more questions for today, so we'll go ahead and close. I would like to thank Brenda for joining us, as well as Texas Closed Captioning for providing the captioning service. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy.